So in the second part on success, I again wanted to refer back to what I was saying earlier concerning shame and failure. A lot of people, when they look around at the world, when they look at those who have been very successful, those who have created multi-million-dollar empires, etc., or are just very, very successful in their particular chosen field. One doesn't have to own a multinational company in order to be considered to be a success. It can be whatever field that you um, choose to work in, and they can look at these individuals and say, well, they haven't done any inner work. Of course, with everything in the world, there are some individuals who are simply able to create a balanced life without ever having been on a workshop, without ever having worked with a coach, without ever having worked with a therapist. They're simply able to do it. But for the majority of us, because there are so many conflicting ideas, and the majority of us have been at the receiving end of limited images and ideas about who we are and what we can achieve, that we've actually taken on board. It's either come from our family of origin, it's come from our ancestry, it's come from the culture that we've been raised in, that we take on these ideas and images, and we indeed take on shame, that we do actually need to do some work in order to work through these parts. But that's not true for everybody. I don't know whether that's fair or unfair, it just is what it is. Some people don't need to do that. However, when we look at the world of business, and when we look at the world of people who have achieved a lot, very often the drive for success is also a drive for power, and that power becomes a substitute for love. One of the greatest and deepest human needs is not only to be loved, but also to give love. For there always has to be an exchange between, or a balance between giving and taking. And so that is when life becomes very satisfying, when there is a balance between giving and taking. And so very often we see that power has become a substitute for love. And so I have worked with wealthy people who are either unable to love or have been very challenged in allowing love into their lives, or are unable to surrender to love. You see, the word success and the word surrender would seem to be complete opposites, because our world of success nowadays is, and perhaps in all days, not just nowadays, but since the history of time, that success and will, and success and drive, and success and a lot of doing. It's about really forcing and pushing the energy forward in order to create something. And so there's a whole level there of what I would call younger soul consciousness, which is having power over, rather than the power from within, which wells up in order to shine forth in our own magnificence. And so many times power then becomes a substitute for love. And that is a basic human need. We have a need to be generous. We have a need to give. We have a need to love others. And therefore, in order to create a life in which there is true balance between giving and taking, and also stepping into our magnificence with our success, then we need to address any and all things that are standing in the way of the heart. And so it also means to look at, what do we really believe about money? What do we really believe when it comes to relationships? What does the word love mean to us? One of the greatest acts of poverty consciousness that I've played, I know that I've played it, and I see it all around the world, is playing what I call the it's only game, where we reduce everything down to a function, where we say that love is only reserved for certain people. So love is only reserved for a husband, a wife, a life partner, or a lover, or a child, or a dog. That love is only reserved for certain people, and that if love exists between myself and someone else, that I have to give a meaning to that relationship, that it has to be a friendship or something more than that. And that's one of the biggest lies that we've all been living according to. And so a lot of that comes from our religious background, our religious training in terms of familiarity between the sexes not allowed, and that love between the sexes is not allowed unless there is a promise of marriage or some other relationship. And so men are not allowed to love one another because of homophobia and other issues, and so that's limited too. And again, there has been this whole cultural and societal programming that's come down through many generations with men about vulnerability and about tenderness. Very often, it has certainly been my experience and the experience of many people that I have known, is that very often when a man opens up with deep vulnerability, he disappears. Because great shame comes up with men and vulnerability. And that also happens with women as well. Many, many women. Particularly nowadays when women are working in traditionally male careers, when they're doctors and lawyers and successful business people, they're often mimicking the same behavior where there is no room for vulnerability. And so it becomes a very frightening thing. I know in my own work, when I coach individuals, when I work with professional people, that their fears start coming up when we start delving into layers of defense and delving into layers of shame to work towards not only being able to have the successful career, but also being able to have love. And so the fear is, if I really allow my vulnerability to be present, if I allow the vulnerability to be present and get to all of the shame around that, then I will simply become incapable. I often talk about individuals who are too capable to love. Too capable to love. And so I include this in the topic of success. So what then is success if success is only a hunger for power? To have the illusion that you have some kind of control over your life. We have no control of our lives. We can have intention, we can have desire, we can have longing, we can move towards something, but we have no control over whether somebody loves us or likes us. We have no control over the weather. We have no control over seismic activity. We have no control over our environment. And so there are big chunks of our life that we have absolutely no control over. There are certain things that we can control, but certainly not all of it. And so vulnerability and creativity and shame and love and surrendering to love are a big, big part of creating success. And so when power becomes the poor substitute for love, then we can have all of the houses and all of the cars, and there's nothing wrong with having any of that. There's a big aspect of spirituality that tries to teach people that having all of those things are bad and material. And they say, well, they don't fill you up. Well, no, they don't. If creating all of that is because power has become a substitute for love, then they will not feed and they will not fulfill. And so very many who are successful or who have strived towards success have often fallen into the, I'm going to call it the abyss of being too capable for love. And so for me, success is defined as how true have we been to the higher vision of ourselves. And so if we start off life saying, well, we want this kind of career, we want this kind of relationship, we want this kind of family, then what is missing? What is missing there? And so shame and failure and the willingness to surrender to all of that, to fall into shame so that we can fall into the deeper beauty and grace of the heart is required. Unfortunately, we can all be tempted to look for shortcuts, hoping that there's going to be some kind of technique, some kind of methodology, some kind of mental understanding so that we can bypass our own pain here. And so what I say to people often is that in my observation, both of myself and others, and I've worked with more than 6,000 people, um, is that we frequently choose long-term suffering over short-term pain. And so the long-term suffering is perhaps suffering years of being on the outside, what everybody calls successful, but on the inside, still feeling hungry for love, still having an empty life when it comes to intimacy, or perhaps having the relationship and not being fulfilled in terms of our creativity. Many people give up big chunks of their lives in order to be in a relationship. And so what is then surrendered is the balance of giving and taking. For a relationship to be truly fruitful, then each individual needs to be honored in their contribution and in their creativity and what they have come to give to the world. And very often people sacrifice their dreams in order to enter into a relationship. And that's part of an image that we have of this is what a relationship is supposed to look like. So this applies both to men and to women. I know that generally women relate to that more quickly than men do when I speak of that, but I have worked with many men who feel enslaved to their mortgages, enslaved by having to be the financial breadwinner to a family and not being able to live out their inner creative impulse because of some of the images they have of what it is to be a man and what their responsibilities are supposed to be. So whilst it can generally be recognized as being largely a problem amongst women, it is also just as much a problem as it is with the men. And so for me, the key is there needs to be a balance between giving and taking, and it takes a great deal of truth-taking to really ask ourselves, when we are striving for success, are we in fact either consciously or subconsciously giving up on the idea of love and choosing power as its poor substitute? And what I'd like to suggest here is that both are possible. Both are possible. And so, even though I'm known as a healer and a spiritual teacher, I'm not here to tell anyone, don't go for that big career of the multi-million-dollar corporation. I want you to go for that if that is what your joy is, if that is what you want to create for yourself. However, in order to stop power becoming the poor substitute for love, then shame and guilt and failure and all of our feelings around that need to be met. And so the core belief that perhaps we have been running from, I know many individuals who have succeeded because their parents were poor. And so they create great wealth, but don't allow the love into their lives. I know those who have made millions and have lost millions, made millions and lost millions, made millions and lost millions, many, many times because of a hidden loyalty they have to the suffering of either their parents or grandparents or great-grandparents or to their people. And so there is something there ancestral that they carry. And there are those who limit themselves because they feel that they don't truly belong. They don't truly belong to the club they now find themselves in. Perhaps they've come from the ghetto, perhaps they come from a particular ethnic background or some other socio-economic background and don't feel that they truly belong to where they are right now, and can cause a lot of self-sabotage. And self-sabotage always comes down to shame. Always comes down to shame. And underneath that shame is something much, much deeper. It is an untrue, it is a false I am statement. And the false I am statement is something along the lines of, I am bad, I am ugly, I am unwanted, I am not enough, I am not good enough. And there's a difference there between I am not enough and I am not good enough. Most of us struggle with not being enough. And one of the things I say with not being enough is that it's true. You're not enough. It is true. None of us are enough. I'm not enough. You're not enough. No one listening to this is enough. And so it is very important that we face that and make peace with it. It doesn't matter if you are one of the world's largest philanthropists. With 7 billion people on the planet, you're not enough. It doesn't matter if you dedicate 16 hours of your day to loving your children. It's not enough. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to hurt and wound your children. It doesn't matter how many hours you dedicate to your craft. It's never going to be enough. And so we need to realize that when we let go into our passion, when we let go into doing what we love to do, then it is a greater part of ourselves that does the work. If we worry that we have to do that without surrendering to a greater intelligence that can work through us, then we will always be worried about not being enough. And the little me is not enough. The little me is not smart enough. The little me does not know how to figure out how to do all of this. But the moment I surrender and just allow myself to be in flow, then it becomes enough, but never for everyone. And so we must make peace with not being enough. And so many who have then substituted power for love, or substituted love for power, so where power has become the poor substitute for love, the deep underlying feeling is, I'm not enough, and it is never enough. So they need more, they need more, they need more, they need more in order to fill the absolute void. And that often comes from not having received enough when very, very young, from being deprived in some way or denied in some way. And that doesn't matter what kind of childhood you've had. You could be born into absolute poverty, or you could be born into a wealthy family and still have that feeling of not having received enough. And it is about not having been brought into deeper intimacy with your parents. And so how many of us were brought into this world and were loved purely for who we are, and not for the potential of who we were supposed to become according to the images and ideas of both parents, schools, religion, country, ethnicity, culture? None of us. Very, very few of us. And so very few of us received enough. And so this underlying wound of not enoughness is then carried forward to us being driven towards always trying to be enough. And so what I say to people is, just stop. Just stop and face the fact that you are not enough. And then let's see what happens. And sometimes a great fear can come up. A great fear. Even the fear of death. If I really acknowledge that I'm not enough, that I might as well give up. And the deeper question is, what am I giving up here? And what really is being given up are all of the defenses and all of the inauthenticities and all of the self-criticism, all of the shoulds and the rules and the laws we've placed upon ourselves that make us strive towards being enough, which is an illusion. And so once that is faced, when not enough has been faced, when we face not being enough, then we can begin to fill up from the inside, and instead of allowing power to be a poor substitute for love, we can then begin to allow love to be the real thing that fills us from the inside out. We can have it all. We can have career and relationship. We can have career and true fulfillment. We can have it all. But in order to do that, we need to face the one thing that nobody wants to face, and that is shame. And so it's an invitation to do that. So, enjoy your success.